What if I told you that how much your cognitive scores bounces around matters more than the scores themselves? That's the variability in your performance, not just your average, that could predict Alzheimer's decline years before traditional tests catch it. For us as APOE4 carriers, this changes everything about how we should be monitoring our brain health. Hi, I'm Dr. Kevin Tran. I'm a doctor of pharmacy and an APOE4 carrier. I'm the founder of the Phoenix Community, a platform dedicated to helping APOE4 carriers beat the odds and defeat Alzheimer's. Through my personal journey with APOE4, I dive deep into the latest research and translate complex findings into hopefully clear and actionable insights that we can all apply today to take control of our brain health. At the AAIC 2025, we had an extraordinary session featuring 6 leading researchers, each presenting different pieces of the same puzzle. Why measuring how much your cognitive performance varies might be even more important than measuring how well you perform. And this isn't just academic theory. We are talking about a marker that predicts decline years in advance, can be measured with standard tests you might already take today, and works with, let's say, a smartphone app and may give us carrier an earlier warning system than anything currently available. And it also helps us define that the interventions that we're implementing in our lives are working or not, which is critical to track. Okay, I just want to give you a disclaimer before you watch this video. We dive deep into how to interpret tests between the different variability and different ways to calculate things. I honestly don't think this session was the most interesting. It was very important for me to listen to it and to understand what it means, because we're building all these tools into the Phoenix and we need to have a great way to measure disease progression and the efficacy of all the interventions that we're doing, meaning that all our members within the Phoenix community are taking so many different tests. If we can measure the variability between those tests and get additional information out of that, it's great. So that's why I had to watch the conference. But to be frank, this video is not the most interesting one, and it goes into very complex information. So if you need to skip that and focus on my other videos, please do so. This is more on the clinician, more on the people who are more interested in mathematics and the way you calculate these states and measure everything. All right, let's dive deep into what 6 of the world's leading experts discovered. So traditional cognitive testing has a blind spot. When you take a battery of neuropsychological tests, the doctor typically looks at your average scores and compares them to population norms. Score below a certain threshold and you might get flagged for cognitive impairment. But Dr. Katie Bangen from UC San Diego and the VA San Diego healthcare system presented groundbreaking research showing that this approach misses a crucial signal hiding in plain sight.
These methods, though, do not account for variability that could reflect early decline that may be detectable before overt impairment is seen.
That variability Dr. Bangen mentioned has a technical name. It's cognitive intra-individual variability, or IIV for short. And it basically measures how much someone's scores bounces around, either across different tests at one time or across repeated testing over time. And there are actually 2 main ways to measure this. The first is called dispersion, which looks at how scattered your scores are across different cognitive tests taken at the same session. Think of it as measuring the spread between your best and worst performances when testing memory, attention, and processing speed all in one sitting. So the second type is called inconsistency, which measures how much your reaction times fluctuate within a single task, trial by trial. This captures moment-to-moment stability as you respond to the same type of challenge repeatedly.
There's many different ways to measure cognitive IIV. It refers to an individual's scatter in performance across trials of a task, which is typically referred to as inconsistency and is assessed with reaction time tasks, or across cognitive measures at a single time point, which is typically referred to as dispersion.
And here's why this matters. 2 people could have identical average scores across a test battery, but vastly different patterns. One person scores consistently around 50 on everything, another person scores 75 on one test, 50 on another, 25 on a third, which is the same average for these two individuals, but completely different cognitive profile. That second person with that huge variability, they are basically showing signs of cognitive vulnerability that traditional scoring completely misses. Their brain is struggling to basically maintain consistent performance across different cognitive domains, a pattern that suggests underlying neural instability or inefficiency. And this isn't just a psychological measure. Dr. Bangen's group has shown that high IIV correlates with actual brain pathology, the physical changes in brain structure and function that underlie Alzheimer's disease and dementia.
Higher IIV has been consistently linked to poorer outcomes, includes cognitive impairment and decline and dementia, Alzheimer's disease biomarkers and neuropathology. Higher IIV relates to entorhinal thinning, hippocampal atrophy, as well as white matter lesions and reduced cerebral blood flow.
So we are now talking about structural brain changes, thinning of the cortex where higher level thinking happens, shrinking of the hippocampus where we form new memories, and damage to white matter connections that allow different brain regions to communicate and reduce blood flow that starves brain tissue of oxygen and nutrients. All the hallmarkers of Alzheimer's progression correlated with how much your scores vary. The thinking is that when Alzheimer's pathology begins disrupting brain network, one of the earliest consequences is inconsistent performance. Your brain can sometimes compensate and perform well, but other times the disrupted network fails to support the task, leading to worse performance. This creates the scatter we measure as IIV. But here's what makes Dr. Bangen's recent study particularly compelling. She didn't just show that IIV correlates with pathology, she showed that it predicts future decline. And that prediction is strongest in exactly the people we care most about, those who are already at elevated risk. So her study included 818 participants from the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative.
About 43% were amyloid positive, and about 39% were APOE4 carriers.
For us as APOE4 carriers, though the study didn't differentiate between those of us with 1 versus 2 copies of the gene, this is exactly the population where early detection matters most. What we don't yet know if these effects differ between being heterozygotes or homozygotes, which is, I believe, critical question for future research to know the impact of the APOE4 gene. Now, before you think measuring IIV requires some exotic new test battery, here's the beautiful part. It actually doesn't.
The one thing that's really nice about cognitive dispersion is you can measure it with our standard neuropsychological measures that we often administer in clinical and research settings. First, you need all your scores on the same metric, T-scores or Z-scores, and you calculate the intra-individual average across test scores. You can calculate the standard deviation around the intra-individual mean, the ISD.
This is critical. IIV can be calculated from tests you might already be taking today. Memory test, attention test, executive function test. You just need score from multiple domains, convert them to the same scale, and calculate how much they vary around on your personal average. The calculation itself is very straightforward. You convert all of your raw test scores to a common metric like the T-score, where 50 is average and each 10 points represent one standard deviation. Then calculate your personal mean across all tests. Finally, you then calculate the standard deviation of your scores around that personal mean. That's your ISD, or intra-individual standard deviation, and a higher ISD means more variability, more scatter in your cognitive profile. It's very elegant, it's simple, and incredibly powerful. If you want more details on how to calculate all of this when you are doing cognitive tests, just leave a comment below and then I'll explain further. So what did Dr. Bangen find when she tracked these 818 people over 3 years? Well, she found that amyloid status, whether you have Alzheimer's protein deposits in your brain detectable on PET scans, dramatically moderates the relationship between IIV and future decline.
So we found that higher baseline IIV predicted faster decline among amyloid positive versus amyloid negative across MoCA, the PAC score, FAQ, and ECOG, so across all of our measures.
This is really fascinating, right? If you're amyloid negative, basically no protein deposits, high IIV doesn't predict much. But if you're amyloid positive, high IIV at baseline predicts steep decline in both cognitive tests and daily functioning over the next 3 years. The cognitive measures included in the MoCA, which is a quick screening test sensitive to early changes, and the PAC, which is preclinical Alzheimer's cognitive composite, which combines tests of episodic memory in executive function and processing speed, while the functional measures included in the FAQ and ECOG which assess real-world abilities like managing your finances, taking medication, and remembering appointments. It's as if the IIV becomes a highly sensitive detector once pathology is present, revealing who's on a fast trajectory versus a slower one, even though they have similar amyloid levels. Now, here's where it gets directly relevant to us APOE4 carriers. Dr. Bangen also looked at APOE4 status.
Higher baseline IV significantly predicted faster functional decline for E4 carriers versus non-carriers for the FAQ and the ECOG, but not for the cognitive measures.
So for us as APOE4 carriers, high IIV predicted faster decline in daily functioning. Not cognitive test scores, but real-world function like managing your finances, taking medication, handling complex tasks. This suggests IIV might be capturing functional vulnerability in us carriers before it shows up on cognitive testing. It's detecting the earliest stage of real-world impact, the subtle inefficiencies in everyday problem-solving and decision-making that family members might notice before formal tests become abnormal. And crucially, Dr. Bangen showed this effect remains significant even after controlling for baseline cognition performance and all the traditional Alzheimer's risk factors.
It does seem that IV is a sensitive marker of decline and seems to have some added utility beyond conventional Alzheimer's disease risk factors that we adjusted for, and also mean level of cognitive performance. So it seems like it is adding something additional of value.
So IIV isn't redundant with what we already measure. It's providing new information about risk that you can't get from age, education, genetics, or average test scores alone. And here's what makes this particularly practical for us.
Especially as we move towards more digital or remote batteries, IV is going to be really valuable in detecting and monitoring earlier cognitive changes in cases where people might not be able to come in person for visits, or when more invasive procedures are not feasible or lower resource environment.
It's all about digital testing, remote monitoring, no need for expensive biomarkers or procedures or in-person visits. IIV could democratize early detection for those of us carriers who want to monitor ourselves closely but don't have access to research-grade PET scans or spinal taps, or maybe because it's too expensive or too painful to do. So this is the foundation. Now let's see how other researchers are expanding on this concept. Great, now let's turn to Dr. Laiss Bertola from the University of Sao Paulo Medical School in Brazil, who presented work that highlight why IIV measurement might be even more valuable in certain populations. Dr. Bertola's research addresses a problem that affects millions worldwide, but often get overlooked in North American research settings.
Neuropsychological assessments usually rely on mean level performance, comparing the participants with established norms. Especially in low and middle income countries like Brazil, we have less studies with good established norms or not really representative of the reality of the country. It adds errors or it limits our interpretation of mean level performance.
So think about what that means. In Brazil and many other countries, the normative databases used to interpret cognitive test scores either don't exist or don't represent the actual population. So different education levels, cultural backgrounds, and language variation. And when you compare someone's score to inappropriate norms, you might flag them as impaired when they're actually normal for their demographics, or miss real impairment because the control group is wrong. This is particularly problematic in countries like Brazil, where educational opportunities have varied dramatically across generations and regions. So IIV offers a very elegant solution here. Instead of comparing you to other people, it compares you to yourself. How variable are your scores relative to your average? This within-person comparison bypasses the need for perfectly matched normative groups because you are essentially serving as your own control. And Dr. Bertola tested this in the ELSA Brazil study, which is a massive longitudinal cohort.
Our final sample consisted of 9,000 participants.
So over 9,000 participants followed for 8 years. This is substantial statistical power to detect real effect and speak to the scale of longitudinal research possible in Brazil public health infrastructure. At baseline, they identified how many people showed atypical AIV, which is the variability that was unusually high even among cognitively normal individuals.
2.4% presented typical intra-individual cognitive variability, and after 8 years, 30% of our sample showed cognitive impairment.
So a small percentage with atypical variability at the start, but substantial conversion to impairment over 8 years, which is actually higher than typical cohorts, possibly reflecting that middle-age enrollment that they had, 35 to 74 years, an 8-year follow-up period. The question, did that initial variability predict who would convert? And the answer was yes. After adjusting for demographics and health factors like depression, hypertension, diabetes, and alcohol use,
For each 1 unit increase in the intra-individual cognitive measure, the odds of cognitive impairment decreased by 6%.
now, a very important note here, in Dr. Bertola's study, they scored variability in reverse. Higher score means less variability. So what this finding means is that more variability was associated with 6% higher odds of developing impairment over 8 years, even after accounting for age, education, and health conditions. So Dr. Bertola, to go into a little bit more details, right, used the coefficient of variation, or what we typically call CV, which is calculated by dividing your ISD by your overall test battery, mean, and converting to a percentage. This method adjusts for the fact that people with higher overall cognitive ability often show more absolute variability simply because they have more room to vary. The CV standardizes this, making it comparable across people with different education and baseline ability levels, particularly important in Brazil's educationally diverse population. And this validates in a massive and diverse longitudinal cohort, what Dr. Bangen was showing in ADNI, basically that cognitive variability at baseline predicts who will decline years later. And it does so in a population where traditional norm-based assessment is limited. This makes IIV particularly valuable for underserved communities and international populations where we lack appropriate normative data, which includes basically most of the world's population outside North America and Western Europe. Right, in the next session, let's shift from measuring variability across tests at a single session to measuring variability across days using smartphone. Dr. Andy Aschenbrenner from the Washington University School of Medicine presented work using their ambulatory research in cognition platform ARC, ARC for short.
Our ambulatory research and cognition smartphone app, or ARC for short. This is a platform we've been using for 8 or so years now to measure cognition in daily life. 3 really short, about a minute cognitive tests. We give them to people 4 times a day at random intervals for 1 week. We get micro assessments of cognition over an extended period of time. And when you average across those sessions, this gives you a lot of advantages in terms of reliability and also statistical powers.
4 times a day for a week, that's 28 cognitive assessments. Each one takes about a minute. That gives you a completely different view of cognition than a single 2-hour neuropsych evaluation. So the 3 tests include a processing speed task where you match symbols, a working memory task where you hold information in mind while manipulating it, and an episodic memory task where you learn and recall information over time. By sampling these brief assessments across different days and time, you are essentially taking multiple snapshots of cognitive function across varying contexts and states. You are capturing performance across different contexts, different time of day, different energy levels, different stress states. And when you look at how much someone's performance bounces around across those 28 sessions, you are measuring day-to-day cognitive stability, your brain's ability to consistently support cognition despite normal fluctuations in sleep, mood, and life circumstances. So what did Dr. Aschenbrenner find when he compared clinically healthy APOE4 carriers to non-carriers?
The difference in variability is statistically significant for people who are APOE positives, indicating that they have more ups and downs across their week of testing in ARC than clinically healthy people who are APOE negative.
What is interesting is even in clinically healthy individuals, basically people with no symptoms, no diagnosis, completely normal neuropsychological testing, APOE4 carriers show more day-to-day variability. For us, as APOE4 carriers, this suggests subclinical cognitive instability associated with our genetic risk, detectable before any clinical symptoms appear. This could reflect reduced cognitive reserve. We basically have less buffer to absorb the normal daily fluctuation everyone experiences. Or it could reflect very early network disruption that doesn't yet impair average performance, but does compromise the brain's ability to consistently maintain optimal function. For us carriers, this is both sobering and potentially valuable. It's another early signal we might be able to track. But here's where Dr. Aschenbrenner's work gets really interesting. He asked a crucial question: what exactly is this daily variability measuring?
What this daily variability might reflect and what I would like it to mean, and what I think most people would want it to mean, is that there's change or momentary fluctuations in how efficient cognition is at a given moment. And this could be due to changes in sleep, stress, motivation, a number of other factors. There's another issue to consider, and momentary variation because there's something distracting in your environment. You get a text message, some noise is going on, and you get distracted, and that will contribute to your daily variability.
This is a critical distinction. Is the variability reflecting true cognitive efficiency fluctuations, basically your brain genuinely performing differently on different days due to sleep quality, stress hormones, or underlying pathology affecting neural function? Or is it just environmental noises, right? Distractions when you're taking a test remotely, like your phone buzzing or someone interrupting you. If it's environmental distraction, the variability might not tell us much about brain health. But if it reflects actual fluctuations in neural efficiency, it could be a sensitive marker of cognitive vulnerability. So to answer this crucial question, Dr. Aschenbrenner analyzed data from the Cogito study, where people came into the lab every day for 100 days and took cognitive tests across multiple domains, which basically would eliminate most environmental distraction, because if variability reflects domain-level cognition fluctuation, you'd expect variability across different tests of the same domain to basically correlate. If it's just environmental distraction, variability might correlate across all tests, regardless of domain. So any distraction would mess up whatever test you happen to be taking at that point in time. So the results were nuanced and methodologically important.
Processing speed is quite nicely correlated with one another in terms of variability. Episodic memory, a little bit less so, but it's still significantly correlated. Working memories, there's virtually zero correlation across your variability scores. If you want to study variability in working memory in daily life, you have to talk about variability in terms of an individual test. You do not see consistent variability across multiple tests.
So variability in processing speed, which is task measuring how quickly and efficiently you process information, well, that variability is a stable, measurable trait across different speed tests. If you are variable on one processing speed task, you are variable on others. This suggests it's capturing a real characteristic of your cognitive system, not just test-specific measurement error. Episodic memory variability, basically your day-to-day fluctuations in learning and recalling new information, shows some consistency across different memory tests, but less than processing speed. But then working memory variability. This is test-specific and not a stable cognitive characteristic. Your variability on one working memory task doesn't predict variability on another working memory task. This tells us that working memory measures in daily variability studies may be capturing more test-specific factors or momentary attention lapses rather than stable cognitive traits. So this tells researchers which domain and which type of test would be most useful for measuring meaningfully variability versus just noise. For us carriers wanting to self-monitor, processing speed tasks are probably the most reliable target. But the most compelling part of Dr. Aschenbrenner's presentation was actually showing that daily cognitive variability has real-world consequences. He partnered with a driving study that put GPS tracker in people's car and monitored everything about their driving behavior. The speed, the braking patterns, accelerations, turn angles, you name it. Then they asked, on days when ARC showed you are having worse cognitive performance than usual, what happened to your actual driving? This is actually very interesting because you see the correlation directly between a test and real life performance.
There is a significant relationship in the expected direction. When you have worse cognition than you normally do, you have more adverse driving events that day.
So they looked at 20,000 car trips, 160 people, and they have a clear finding. On your bad cognitive days, measured by a smartphone app, you have more hard braking, you have more speeding, you have more sudden acceleration events the same day. This validates that daily variability isn't just a statistical noise. It reflects real cognitive state changes that affect real-world safety. Your reaction times are slower, your decision-making is less optimal, and your ability to anticipate and respond to traffic situations is compromised, and measurably so. But here's an equally fascinating finding that suggests we have some metacognitive awareness of our cognitive state. We can sense at some level when we are not at our best.
When you have worse cognitive scores, according to ARC, you are choosing to take fewer night trips that day than you might otherwise. It appears that at some level you're aware of your lessened cognitive ability at the daily level and can adjust appropriately.
So this is interesting. People seem to know at some level when they are having an off day, and they adjust their behavior. They avoid risky nighttime driving on days when they're cognitively vulnerable. This suggests we have this implicit awareness of our cognitive state, even if we can't explicitly articulate, like, my cognition is 15% below baseline today. And this suggests potential self-monitoring interventions for us carriers. If we can track our daily cognitive variability and make it explicit, like you are having a low day today, we might be able to make smarter decisions about when to attempt cognitively demanding or risky tasks. Maybe you don't sign that important contract or make that major financial decision on a low cognition days. Maybe you don't drive to that unfamiliar location in bad weather. Now, if we zoom in even further from day-to-day variability to variability within a single 20 to 30 second task, Dr. Matt Welhaf from the Night Alzheimer Disease Research Center presented work showing that meaningful cognitive variability can be detected at ultra-short timescales. Using the same ARC platform that Dr. Aschenbrenner described, Dr. Welhaf looked at trial-to-trial variability within individual tasks. A single ARC task might have 12 trials taking about 20 to 30 seconds total. He calculated how much people reactions time bounced across just those 12 trials, then average that across their week of testing. This is measuring inconsistency, the other type of IIV we discussed at the beginning. Instead of looking at how your scores vary across different cognitive domains or across different days, this looks at how stable your performance is from one moment to the next within a single cognitive challenge. Are you hitting consistent reaction times of 500 to 550 milliseconds, or are you all over the place, 300 milliseconds on one trial, 800 on the next? When he compared APOE4 carriers to non-carriers, here's what he found out.
We can capture substantial intra-individual variability across participants. Critically, this is a significant difference between these two groups with a modest effect size. E4 carriers are more variable across a week of cognitive testing and just a single task across the 12 trials.
Even within 20 to 30 seconds, we as APOE4 carriers show significantly more variability than non-carriers. This suggests the cognitive vulnerability associated with our genetic risk is detectable at extremely granular timescales. It's not just about performance on different days or across different test types, it's moment-to-moment stability. This trial-level inconsistency have been theorized to reflect lapses in attention, momentary mind wandering, or reduced neural efficiency, which is the brain's ability to consistently and reliably execute the same cognitive operation repeatedly. So you see, in healthy brains, neural networks can sustain consistent activation patterns to support repeated performance. But when early Alzheimer's pathology or genetic vulnerability disrupt those networks, performance becomes erratic even across seconds. We don't yet know if this differs between E4 heterozygotes or homozygotes, which I believe is a key question for understanding our individual risk profiles and the actual impact of APOE4. But Dr. Welhaf also addressed an important question. When you are doing remote smartphone-based testing, how much does context matter? Are people performing worse because they're cognitively impaired or because they're testing in distracting environments? This reflects what we discussed like just earlier in this video, right? So his team built questions into ARC, asking people where they are and who they are with at each testing session.
Where you are right now, they're at their house or they're away from home, and then who they are with, whether they are alone versus around family member, spouse, that might contribute to this distraction.
Then they tested whether location or social context affected performance and whether those effects obscure disease-related cognitive differences. So the concern would be if people with early dementia happens to test more often in distracting environments, you might mistake environmental effects for disease effects. Or conversely, if healthy control tests in optimal quiet environment, you might overestimate the disease effect by comparing impaired people in suboptimal context to healthy people in optimal context.
These contextual effects are apparent. Cognitively normal to very mild impaired individuals show, the expected effects, But there are some differences once you start accounting for contextual factors. The effect sizes are rather small, though, which despite all these distractions, we're still able to get these effects, and they are, not disruptive to our overall conclusions.
So this is reassuring, right? Yes, where you are and who you are with affects performance slightly. Testing away from home in a busy coffee shop with people around will lower scores compared to testing alone at home in your quiet study. But the effect sizes are actually small, maybe 2-5% of the variance, which is incredibly smaller than what I thought it would be. And cognitive differences between normal and impaired individuals still emerge clearly, accounting for far more variance than contextual factors. So what you can remember is disease effects aren't being drowned out by environmental noise. This remote testing signal is robust enough to detect meaningful cognitive differences despite less than perfect testing conditions. Dr. Welhaf also presented work on time-of-day effects, showing that when you take the test matters, particularly for people with preclinical Alzheimer's pathology.
When people are taking their tests, at least for individuals who are CSF positive, there's a slight effect of increased errors on the memory test when they are taking those tests at night. There seems to be something kind of referred to in the literature as cognitive sundowning, in which individuals are getting kind of worse cognitive performance when they're taking tests at night.
So this is called like cognitive sundowning, which is worse performance in the evening hours in people with CSF evidence of Alzheimer's pathology, but not in CSF negative individuals. This suggests circadian vulnerability might be an early marker of preclinical AD, which is the brain's ability to maintain optimal function, may decline more steeply across the day when early pathology is present, possibly reflecting impaired lymphatic clearance, disrupted circadian gene expression, or cumulative effects of metabolic waste products that builds up during your waking hours and are normally cleared during sleep. Dr. Welhaf's key conclusion brings together the findings across multiple timescales.
Intra-individual variability at different levels is important, right? We've seen that from the dispersion literature, we've seen that across sessions, but even on the scale of 20 to 30 seconds, we are capturing meaningful information.
Variability matters across tests, across days, or even within brief tasks. Each timescale provides meaningful complementary information about cognitive health. They are not redundant. They are capturing different aspects of cognitive stability, from broad profile inconsistencies to day-to-day fluctuations to moment-to-moment neural reliability. Now we come to a critical, practical challenge in this fifth presentation. Everything we've discussed so far sounds promising, but here's the problem. If your doctor tells you your cognitive dispersion score is 20.41, what does that mean? Well, Dr. Andrew Kiselica from the University of Georgia addressed this interpretability gap.
Cognitive dispersion appears to be sensitive to neuropathology. Cognitive dispersion measures are related to the diagnosis of dementia with Lewy bodies, brain injuries, as well as other Alzheimer's disease biomarkers and cortical volume loss. The thinking right now is that is a highly sensitive but not always specific marker of cognitive decline. The issue with that is that raw cognitive dispersion scores at the moment are kind of uninterpretable. We understand that 20.41 is greater than a 0, but by how much and what does that mean clinically, we don't really know.
So from now, you see that IAV shows promise as a sensitive marker of pathology. It goes up when something's wrong, but without normative data, we can't distinguish normal variability from pathological variability. Some healthy people are naturally more variable than others based on cognitive style, test-taking approach, or stable individual differences. The question is how much variability crosses the line from normal individual differences to concerning pathological pattern. Dr. Kiselica's solution is to create the first comprehensive norm for cognitive dispersion measures.
The first normative study for cognitive dispersion measures using data from the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center included 4,283 cognitively unimpaired older adults. We then demographically adjusted those scores for age, sex, education, and race and ethnicity. To yield demographically adjusted z-scores. And this allowed us to talk in terms of standard deviation units and percentile ranks, which are much more interpretable than just the raw score of 20.41. We can now talk about that as one standard deviation below the mean.
Over 4,000 cognitively normal older adults demographically adjusted for age, sex, education, and race, ethnicity, This basically allows raw dispersion scores to be converted into z-scores and percentiles, the same interpretive framework clinicians already use for every other cognitive measures. The demographic adjustment is crucial because variability isn't uniform across groups. Older adults tend to show more variability than younger adults, possibly reflecting subtle age-related changes in neurostability. Education affects variability patterns. Those with higher education often show less variability, potentially reflecting greater cognitive reserve. And without adjusting for these factors, you might misclassify someone as abnormal when they're normal within their demographic group. Now, when you see a dispersion score, you can say this person is at the 15th percentile for their age or education, or 1.5 standard deviation above the mean variability. That's clinically actionable. We know for decades of neuropsychology that 1.5 standard deviation below normal is a common threshold for what we would call impairment. So Dr. Kiselica then validated these norms by testing how well they discriminate between normal cognition and Lewy body disease, a condition characterized by cognitive fluctuations and therefore expected to show high dispersion.
We looked at the ability of those normed demographically adjusted z-scores to differentiate the cognitively normal sample from an additional group of 282 people who had cognitive impairment due to Lewy body disease. And we found very good ability of our cognitive dispersion scores to differentiate between these two groups with an area under the curve of 0.82.
So to explain it a little bit, an AAIC of 0.82 is excellent discriminative ability, approaching the performance of very good biomarkers like cerebrospinal fluid, tau, or certain neuroimaging measures. For context, an AUC of 0.5 means chance discrimination, basically conflict. 0.7 to 0.8 is considered good, and above 0.8 is excellent. This validates that norm dispersion scores captures clinically meaningful differences. But Dr. Kiselica also uncovered something important about when IAV measurement is most useful. When he looked at retest reliability, how stable dispersion scores, and when you test someone again a month later, the result differed dramatically depending on clinical status.
And when we look at the test-retest reliability, it was pretty poor compared to the global composite, test-retest correlation of 0.35. We looked at this in a sample of cognitively normal individuals, and we think that those measures of variability are really just capturing chance variation or error in that group, as opposed to meaningful variation. And when other groups looked at this in a sample that was already diagnosed with MCI, test-retest reliability was quite a bit better, suggesting that dispersion scores are more psychometrically robust in clinical populations, or at least more clinically meaningful.
So this is crucial for understanding when to use IAV measures. In cognitively normal people, IAV shows poor test-retest reliability, a correlation of 0.35 compared to 0.8 or 0.9 for most standard cognitive tests. This means someone's dispersion scores at visit 1 doesn't strongly predict the dispersion score at visit 2. It's mostly just noise, random ups and downs that don't reflect stable pathology. But in people with MCI, IAV becomes much more reliable and stable. The high variability persists across testing sessions, indicating it reflects the stable characteristics of the cognitive system rather than random fluctuation. This suggests IAV might not be a great preclinical biomarker in asymptomatic individuals, but becomes highly informative once cognitive symptoms begin. And Dr. Kiselica confirmed this by examining how IAV relates to Alzheimer's biomarkers, amyloid, tau, neurodegeneration measured in cerebrospinal fluid. Those are separately cognitively intact versus impaired groups.
If you look at the red line, you can see that as the amount of amyloid increases in the brain, we get an increasing amount of dispersion. That was true for the impaired group. There was a significant correlation at the moderate to strong strength level, but that was not true for the intact group. There was virtually no correlation between the amyloid burden and the dispersion scores. Dispersion scores seem to relate significantly to Alzheimer's pathology burden in the clinical stage, but not the non-clinical stage of the disease.
So in cognitively impaired individuals, higher amyloid burdens predicts higher IAV, moderate to strong correlation. In cognitively intact individuals, no correlation at all, zero. People with high amyloid but no symptoms don't show elevated dispersion. The same pattern held for tau and neurodegeneration markers. Only one symptoms appear, does the pathology-IAV relationship emerge. This challenges the idea of using dispersion-based IAV as a preclinical screening tool in asymptomatic people. It appears dispersion becomes meaningful once the disease process has progressed to the point of affecting cognition. Perhaps because compensatory mechanisms that maintain consistent performance finally fail, or because pathology reaches critical brain regions that support performance stability.
We can effectively interpret cognitive dispersion scores if we have norms. Norm dispersion scores may capture chance variation or error in cognitively normal individuals as opposed to something that's clinically meaningful. But when we move into individuals with cognitive impairment, there does seem to be very good sensitivity of these scores to capturing pathology-driven variability in cognitive performance.
So dispersion-based IAV appears most valuable once symptoms begin for tracking progression, distinguishing different types of dementia, or predicting rate of decline in people who already show signs. For us, if we are asymptomatic APOE4 carriers, the daily variability measures that Dr. Aschenbrenner and Dr. Welhaf described, measuring ups and downs across days of living tasks, might be more useful for early detection than the dispersion measures across different test types that Dr. Kiselica studied. But once we develop any cognitive symptoms, dispersion becomes a powerful prognostic tool for understanding our trajectory. Lastly, the final presentation by Dr. Truc, Nguyen from the National Taiwan University tackled a methodological question that has major implications for how we should calculate and interpret IAV. Should we use the raw intra-individual standard deviation, or should we use the coefficient of variation that adjusts for mean performance? This might sound very technical, but it matters a lot for practical application and can change your conclusions.
Cognitive dispersion is currently primarily used either as ISD, intra-individual standard deviations, or the COV. So the COV is the ISD divided by the OTBM. The advantages of COV, first is unitless because it's the ISD divided by the OTBM. So you can use COV as a percentage. The second advantage of COV is that it's controlled for mean performance. However, the interpretation of COV might be more nuanced for two main reasons. First, there's a possibility that the true associations we see between COV and other characteristics, it could be actually with mean performance rather than dispersion. And the second, using COV, we could also be missing if there's an interaction between OTBM and ISD.
Let's break this down. Coefficient of variation sounds ideal. It adjusts variability for mean performance levels, making it comparable across people with different overall ability levels. Someone who scores 70 on average and has a standard deviation of 10 points gets the same CV as someone who scores 35 on average with a standard deviation of 5 points, both 14% variability. But by mathematically combining mean and variability into one number, you might be hiding important information about how they interact. Perhaps having low performance and high variability is particularly bad in a way that's worse than you'd expect from either alone. That multiplicative risk will be hidden if you just look at CV. And Dr. Nguyen tested this directly by comparing 4 different statistical models predicting MCI diagnosis and brain structure, specifically the entorhinal cortex thickness, which is one of the earliest brain regions to show Alzheimer's-related atrophy.
We used data from 200 participants. Half of them were cognitively normal, and the other half were having AMCI. And these were age, education, and sex matched groups. Overall, on average, participants were around 70 years of age, about 13 years of education, about 2/3 of them were females.
So carefully matched case control design to eliminate demographic confounds. When you match groups like this, any differences you find are more likely to reflect true disease effects rather than age or education between groups.
30 measures were collected from 16 tests that looked at memory, attention, executive functions, visual, spatial function, and language.
Broad coverage across cognitive domains. 30 measures gives you a lot of information to calculate dispersion, more than the 6 to 12 measures typically used. More measures potentially give you a more stable estimate of someone's true variability. An important baseline observation was then made.
This is the correlation between OTBM and ISD study we consider is moderate strength between these two constructs. And this correlation strength is similar across cognitively normal and MCI participants.
Moderate correlation between mean performance and variability, they are related but not redundant. So this correlation is exactly why the choice between ISD and CV matters. If they were completely independent, it wouldn't matter. If they were completely redundant, you couldn't separate them anyway. All right, now let's conclude and step back and synthesize what these 6 world-leading researchers revealed about cognitive variability. First, the fundamental insights. How much cognitive performance varies might matter more than your average performance for predicting Alzheimer's decline. Traditional assessments that focus solely on mean scores are missing a crucial signal. The signal in the noise is actually the noise itself. Second, this variability exists at multiple timescales across different tests at one session, which is dispersion, across days and weeks, which is daily variability, and even within a single 20 to 30 second task, which is inconsistency. Each timescale provides meaningful information about different aspects of cognitive stability. Third, for us as APOE4 carriers, the finding shows that we show more day-to-day variability even when clinically healthy. We show more trial-level variability within brief tasks, and higher IIV predicts faster functional decline for us carriers, particularly on measures of daily functioning like managing finances or medications. We don't know yet if these effects differ between E4 heterozygotes or homozygotes, given that homozygotes face much higher Alzheimer's risk compared to non-carriers. Understanding whether IIV patterns differ by dosage is crucial for personalized risk assessments. So these patterns suggest cognitive instability associated with our genetic risk is detectable before clinical symptoms, particularly in measures of daily variability and trial-level inconsistency. Fourth, IIV predictive power is strongest in people who already have Alzheimer's pathology. If you are amyloid positive, high IIV predicts steep decline in cognition and functioning. In preclinical stages without pathology, dispersion measures may reflect mostly noises. This suggests that different strategies for different stages. Daily variability monitoring via apps like ARC might be useful for us asymptomatic carriers to track subclinical changes, the day-to-day ups and downs that might signal emerging vulnerability. Meanwhile, dispersion measures become highly informative once cognitive symptoms or biomarkers evidence appears, helping predict trajectory and guide treatment decisions. Fifth, practical accessibility. IIV can be calculated from standard neuropsych tests already administered in clinical settings, measured via smartphone apps that just take a few minutes a day and doesn't require expensive biomarkers or in-person visits. Dr. Bertola's work shows it's particularly valuable when normative data is limited, which basically is the entire world except the United States and Western Europe. So this democratizes early detection. You don't need to have access to a 5K amyloid PET scans or 1.5K lumbar puncture for CSF biomarkers. You need a smartphone or access to standard cognitive testing, making this approach scalable globally. 6, we have norms now, making IIV scores interpretable in standard clinical terms, percentiles, and Z-scores that clinicians already understand. And we have methodological guidance, Dr. Nguyen, who suggests we should model mean performance and variability as interacting predictors rather than collapsing them into a single coefficient variation. This provides richer information about someone's cognitive status and risk profile. I just want to close by mentioning that this video was extremely technical. I personally wanted to watch it because we are building all these tools and all these tests into the Phoenix community, and I need to understand all of that. I definitely would understand if you hated that video, you found it extremely boring, and you didn't understand much. Just stay confident in the fact that I watched that and I'm building these variability or these IIV scores into the tests that we're building for the Phoenix community to be able to basically measure your disease progression or the efficacy of your interventions that we have in the Phoenix. All right, I hope you still enjoyed the video and I hope you have a great day.